Hello students, in the previous lecture we discussed about Morgenthau's 6 principles of realism and the role of balance of power and diplomacy as power management devices. In this lecture we will discuss about Kenneth Walters' structural realism, also known as defensive realism, which in many ways differs from classical realism of Morgenthau. So let us start with Kenneth Walters' structural realism, also known as Neo-Realism. During the 1960s, wars in Algeria and Vietnam constituted the main sources of challenge to trigger a discussion on the legitimate right of the sovereign states to use force in international relations. You know, there was a war in Vietnam between North Vietnam and South Vietnam on the question of communism. South Vietnam was supported by America, North Vietnam was supported by China and the Soviet Union, and it is basically related to the war that was on communism and also the unification of the nation. At the end of this Vietnam War, actually forced the United States to withdraw from Vietnam, and it was widely understood as a kind of defeat to a superpower. So this war in Vietnam particularly raised a lot of questions on the fundamental pillars of classical realism, and also it led to the emergence of neo-realism. So this led to the relative weakening of the fundamental pillars of classical realism and the emergence of neo-realism, a scientific method that systematically studies the core doctrines of the realist thought in a structural model in international relations. In 1979, the publication of Kenneth Walters' Theory of International Politics established structural realism, or what we call neo-realism, as a dominant theory in international politics. Kenneth Walters regards Morgenthau as the first image theorist and criticizes his approach on 3 accounts. So because Morgenthau was basically talking of the human nature, he was talking about the state. So that's why Kenneth Walters considered him as the first image theorist, and then he criticized Morgenthau. That ultimately led to his theory of neo-realism. On 3 accounts he criticized Morgenthau. The first was, Morgenthau's account of human nature is entirely hypothetical, since we can't empirically verify the true human nature. So there is nothing on the basis of which you can scientifically verify the human nature. Sometimes you may be cooperative, sometimes you may be confrontational. Today your mood is fine, tomorrow your mood may not be fine. So there is no scientific basis on the basis of which you can study human nature, and that was the first criticism of Walters against Morgenthau. This in turn makes it impossible to assess the validity of his thesis. So basically, when you cannot scientifically study the human nature, and if your theory is based on that, that again creates the problem of validity. Second, Morgenthau's essentialist conception of human nature is problematic, since a constant cannot explain a variation. For example, if human nature were the cause of war in 1914, the same human nature was responsible for peace in 1919. So the point is, you cannot study a constant variable because that gives 2 different kinds of outcomes. So that was the second problem. Third, Walters accuses Morgenthau of reductionism, since the latter tries to explain the whole by the sum of its part. So according to Walters, you cannot understand the whole just by focusing on its parts. If you want to study the whole, you have to focus on the whole, not on the parts. So that was the reason why he was unhappy with the classical realism propounded and scientifically studied by Morgenthau, and that is the reason why he developed his own theory of realism that we call structural realism. Thus, he rejects the classical realist arguments that human nature and the domestic character of the states are relevant factors for explaining what is happening in international politics. So neither the domestic factor is important nor the human nature is important. That was basically the focus of classical realism. War, alliances, and the formation of balance of power and the precarious nature of cooperation cannot be explained by focusing on the behavior of the units or the states in themselves. So, these are important international issues such as war, the alliances, the formation of balance of power. So, these are even the nature of cooperation in international relations. So, these cannot be studied just focusing on the behavior of some units of the system. So, that was the issue raised by Waltz. States or units must be treated as empty boxes because their domestic arrangements and characteristics do not really make a difference at the level of international system. So, the traditional realist or the classical realist, they consider the states as the black box because that contains a lot of information about the working of international politics. But according to Waltz, they are not black boxes, rather they are empty boxes because domestic arrangements and the internal character of the state is not at all important for understanding the way international politics is working. At the international level, it is the fundamental structure of anarchy that shapes the behavior of the units or the states, not their internal makeup. So, if you have to understand international politics, you have to focus on the fundamental structure of anarchy and particularly how the international system influences the behavior of the states, which is characterized by what he calls anarchy, that shapes the behavior of states and units. And so, in this case, your internal arrangement, your domestic system, you are a presidential system or a parliamentary system, you are a democratic country or authoritarian. So, these issues are not important. So, that is why he basically focused on the international structure, or that is why we call it as structural realism. The concept of structure is defined in three ways. So, Waltz defines it in three important ways. First, is that international system is anarchical as there is no world government. So, I had made it already clear that when we talk of anarchy in international relations, that does not mean absence of law and order, that does not mean the absence of the kind of rules and regulations that of course these are there, but anarchy basically refers to the absence of the world government, the selfish behavior of the sovereign states. So, that was the reason why he says international relations is basically characterized by anarchy. But this anarchy, the classical realists, they also talked about anarchy, but this concept of anarchy has nothing to do with human nature, rather it is the result of the international structure. Second, international system is composed of like units. So, all states are sovereign, they are equal, and they almost perform the same kind of functions like national defense, tax collection, or even economic regulation. So, all these functions are more or less done by all the states, not just the developing or developed states, rather all states, those who are sovereign and equal. But the problem is they have difference in power capabilities. So, they perform same functions, but they are not same in terms of power, in terms of capability. Some are powerful, there are some very powerful countries, there are very less powerful countries. So, on that basis we also say superpower, great power, middle power, or even the weak countries or developing countries. So, there are lots of categorization of countries on the basis of their power position. So, that is again another reason for understanding the structure of international relations. So, the first is anarchy, the second is they are composed of all the units, those who perform more or less same functions, and finally states although perform same type of functions, they are not same in terms of their power capability. So, there are powerful, there are less powerful countries. So, international relations is thus an anarchy composed of states, those who vary in their power position, and this anarchy is likely to endure because according to Waltz, states wants to preserve their autonomy. So, this anarchical situation is the result of the international structure, and this anarchical condition will prevail because all the states wants to preserve their autonomy. So, this is the reason why the states will be all interested in formulating a kind of foreign policy that takes into account their survival, their autonomy in international relations. The neo-realists argue that international organizing principles of anarchy necessarily tends towards tension, conflict, and unavoidable possibility of war for three major reasons. So, if all the states are interested for their autonomy, because all states are different in their power position, so that ultimately leads to the problem of war, conflict, sometimes in tension between and among the countries. So, then he explains what are the reasons why the states will engage in conflict or even war. In the first place, as states are separate, autonomous and formally equal political units, they must ultimately rely on their own resources to realize their interests. So you have to depend on your own. You have to get and also acquire different kinds of resources that would really make you powerful. So it means international anarchy therefore results in a system of self-help, because states cannot count on others for their own security. So if you have to think that you have to maintain power, you have to accumulate power, or you have to get various resources for your power, so that is fine, but you have to depend on yourself, or what he calls it's a kind of self-help, because you can't trust others, you can't depend on others. Sometimes they may ditch you, sometimes they may not help you, because they will also support you in a way that serves their interests. So that happened with India when America decided to stop food supply to India during the war in 1965. So the point is you cannot depend on others, so you have to depend on your own resources, and that is why he talks about self-help, because that is the best help you can do for yourself. Second, relationship between and amongst the states are always characterized by uncertainty and suspicion. So because everyone is doing the same, everybody accumulating power, everybody is depending on self-help, so that definitely leads to uncertainty and suspicion in the minds of the states. This is best explained through security dilemma. A military build-up for defensive reasons may be considered as offensive by your neighboring countries. So if you develop a new weapon, if you gather a new weapon, if you purchase a new weapon, that is not considered something as very defensive by your neighboring countries. For example, if America develops a new kind of nuclear weapons or armament, that is not taken lightly by China, because China thinks that because it has a lot of issues with America, so America may create problem for Chinese security. So China would consider a defensive kind of weapon by America as offensive. Similarly, if China develops a kind of weapon to counter America, India will also feel the same. India may consider it as offensive because India has a lot of problem with China. So China may use that kind of weapon to neutralize Indian security. If India happens to develop that kind of weapon which it considers as necessary for its own security, that may create problem or security dilemma for Pakistan, because Pakistan has a lot of problem with India, and it may feel threatened because India has a different kind of weapon which may be superior than it was in case of Pakistan. So the problem is it's a kind of chain reaction. So if one country does something, the others will follow the suit, or others will follow the steps. So that is the problem of security dilemma. Third, conflict is also encouraged by the fact that states are primarily concerned about maintaining or improving their position relative to other states. So whenever there is any new step, all states interpret it differently. If there is a new idea for any regional organization in South Asia, India and Pakistan will interpret it differently. Pakistan, being a weak country vis-a-vis India, will interpret whether that new organization is going to be beneficial to India, it's going to serve India's agenda or purpose, is it going to improve India's relative power position. So Pakistan will consider that it will not consider whether it is going to benefit Pakistan or not. It will definitely that they will do, of course, but they will also look at this fact that whether that event is going to add more power to India or not. So that is also a consideration they will consider. So the point is so relative power position is important, but particularly any kind of event that, or any kind of weapon, any kind of happening, if that contributes to the relative power of a rival country or competitive country, that is also taken seriously by the neighboring country. So that is again the problem. So apart from anything else, this discourages cooperation and reduces the effectiveness of international organization. So if there is any international organization or if there is an attempt for any regional organization or even sub-regional organizations, so state would interpret that in a very different way. They will particularly interpret it whether it is going to help the adversary, help the competitor or not, and that is the reason why there is no regional cooperation in South Asia, because SAARC can be interpreted in that way. There are problems between India and Pakistan, but again there is a perception that SAARC may benefit India more than what it can do for Pakistan. So that is a problem. So in that way we can understand the working of international organizations in international politics, and also we also can understand the level of cooperation between and among the countries on this basis. So that is how structural realism of Kenneth Waltz helps us to understand the operation of international relations or the working of international politics in a much structured way. However, the fact that states are inclined to treat other states as their enemies do not necessarily lead to war or violence. Rather, neo-realists, in common with the classical realists, think that conflict can be contained by the balance of power, a key concept for all realist theories. So, if everybody is accumulating power, nobody is trusting the other country, everybody is creating the problem of security dilemma for other states, that ultimately may lead to bloodshed, may lead to violence, but that does not mean international politics will always characterized by war and violence. Rather, states would try to contain the violence through devices like the balance of power. On this basis, the neo-realists are in the same page with the classical realist. However, while classical realists treat balance of power as a product of prudent statecraft, neo-realists see it as a consequence of structural dynamics. So, they may believe on balance of power, but how this balance of power will result, that again is a subject of difference between the classical realist and the neo-realist. Particularly the classical realists consider that it is a kind of product of the statecraft. States would need balance of power to balance or to checkmate the rival countries or competitive countries. But according to Waltz, it's not that they take a prudent decision for balance of power, rather the international structure would actually force the countries to think about balance of power. So, it is not a natural result of statecraft, or it is not a conscious decision of the statecraft or the decision makers, rather it is actually the product of international system that again makes it different from the classical realism. In short, the principal factor affecting the likelihood of a balance of power and therefore the prospect of war or peace are the number of great powers operating in the international system. So, whether there will be peace, there will be conflict, it all depends on the number of powers, how the world is divided, is it dominated by one single power, is it dominated by two major powers or superpowers, is it multipolar. So, this question, this is again important for understanding the nature of peace and security in international politics. Although the neo-realists believe that there is a general bias in the international system in favor of balance rather than imbalance, world order is basically determined by the changing fate of great powers. So, it is actually the power distribution that has a great impact on the continuity of peace, conflict, or even it may lead to war. So, this all depends on the changing nature of the great powers. If you are a great power today, you may not be a great power tomorrow, as we have seen in case of France and UK. So there is no guarantee. So, your fate of being a great power is not guaranteed. So, that is the problem, and this is reflected in an emphasis on polarity. We have seen that UK was the superpower before the Second World War. It is just a normal power after the Second World War because its position was overtaken by the United States, and the Soviet Union was a superpower, but it collapsed. Today many are talking of the decline of American power position. So, there is no guarantee. Nobody thought about China as a major world power, but it has happened. Nobody has thought about India, but it has happened. So, the issue is there is no guarantee that you will continue to remain a superpower forever. So, that is the tragedy in international politics. Neo-realists have generally associated bipolar system with stability and reduced likelihood of war, while multipolar system is associated with instability and a greater likelihood of war. So, basically for the neo-realist, bipolar system is more stable because there are two clear-cut superpowers and there is relative stability in the international system, but they are not in favor of a unipolar world or a multipolar world, because in a unipolar world, because there is no countervailing power to checkmate the dominant power. So that may encourage the dominant power to intervene and engage in military conflicts in other parts of the world, as we have seen that in case of America in 1991 Gulf War. So the point is, unipolar world is not very stable according to the neo-realist. Similarly, the neo-realists are also not in favor of a multipolar world that consists of so many great powers, because they will always fight against each other, and that may again create the problem. So the neo-realist would cite the example of Russia and Ukraine war as an example that it happened in a multipolar world. So they are in favor of bipolar world because that promises long peace. Realists nevertheless disagree about the relationship between structural instability and the likelihood of war. So this is the point, structural stability and the likelihood of war. These are two issues that actually help us to understand the nature of international relations. Although neo-realist thinking had a profound impact both within and beyond the realist tradition since 1990s, realist theories have often attempted to fuse system analysis with unit level approach, giving rise to what has been called neoclassical realism or post neo-realism. So you will find that the neo-realists basically focused on the international system. They are focusing on the systemic level of analysis, but there were problems because you cannot guarantee or you cannot really understand the problem of war and peace in just by focusing on the structural factor or the systemic factor. Rather, there is a need to combine the individual level of analysis and also the domestic level of analysis to understand this problem. So that's why there was a new challenge to neo-realism, and that challenge was posed by neoclassical realism that combined the best elements of classical realism and the structural realism. So that is the reason that we are going to focus, and we will try to understand this after some time. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. We have discussed that Waltz rejects classical realism's major assumptions that human nature and domestic character of states are relevant factors in explaining the fundamental aspects of international relations. To Waltz, it is fundamental structure of anarchy that shapes the behavior of the states, not their internal makeup or political character. And anarchy is likely to endure because states want to preserve their own autonomy. For this reason, anarchy necessarily tends towards tension, conflict, and unavoidable possibility of war that can be contained by the balance of power and effective use of diplomacy. Thus, balance of power is a consequence of the structural dynamics of the international system, not a product of prudent statecraft, as the classical realists argue. This means balance of power is something a consequence of the anarchical state of nature in international relations, not a kind of prudent device or statecraft that the decision makers or the policy makers of the state would devise. We will discuss the other variants of neo-realism such as offensive realism and neoclassical realism in the next lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you once again.